Hello, and welcome to MDIC's Annual Public Forum. During today's session, you will hear about new frontiers in access with real-world evidence development from Jeff Farkas, Senior Director of Health Policy and Payment at Medtronic and Chair of MDIC's Health Economics and Patient Value Steering Committee, as well as Tamara Syrek Jensen, Director of the Coverage and Analysis Group at CMS, and representatives from Edwards Life Sciences, the National Health Council, and Blue Cross Blue Shield. Please make sure to join in the conversation on Twitter by following at MDIC Annual Forum and using the hashtag MDICAPF2020. Now, please welcome session moderator, Jeff Farkas.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's installation of the MDIC Annual Public Forum. Today's forum focuses on new frontiers in access with real-world evidence development. And today's forum, in fact, focuses on a variety of issues that are important from a payer perspective. A lot of the forums thus far in the series have looked at issues with respect to regulatory application of real-world evidence related to devices. Today, we move on to look at some very specific issues in the payer world. I'm pleased to introduce a great panel that we have today, featuring representatives from both the device industry as well as from payer and patient organizations. This is a really great group that we have. I know that we're going to have a great discussion with respect to the issues that are involved in the use of real-world evidence in payer contexts, such as payer coverage decision-making. I will be leading today's panel. And again, my name is Jeff Farkas. I am co-chair of MDIC's Health Economics and Patient Value Initiative. I'm also vice president of Global Health Economics and Reimbursement Government Affairs at Medtronic Diabetes. I've been with Medtronic for 18 years and spent a long time in the industry working on reimbursement and coverage issues. And I'm pleased to be able to work with this esteemed group today on real-world evidence issues. After I speak, we'll have Greg Daniel, who is the head of U.S. healthcare policy at Edwards Life Sciences. He'll be followed by Naomi Aronson, who is executive director of clinical evaluation, innovation, and policy at the Blue Cross and Blue Shield Association. And many of you will know her from the important role that Blue Cross Blue Shield plays in assessing evidence related to medical device and medical technologies. We're joined by Eleanor Perfetto, who is Executive Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at the National Health Council, and again, brings important patient perspectives to the topics of real-world evidence. And then last, but certainly not least, we're joined by Tamara Syrek Jensen, who is the Director of the Coverage Analysis Group at CMS, and who is a critical actor in all of the work that technology developers, companies do, patients who await access. The work that Medicare does can't be understated with respect to its implications for patient access and what other payers do as well. So we are incredibly pleased to have Tamara with us as well. Wanted to give a little bit of background on the work that MDIC has been doing in the payer space overall. As you know, MDIC is an organization that was created to advancing regulatory science, but in its work also determined that there is an important need to look at some of the issues and how they apply in the patient perspective and the payment world. And therefore, MDIC created the Health Economics and Patient Value Initiative. And you can see here some of the rationales related to that, ultimately to create predictability and transparency of the evidence requirements for coverage and improving pathways for coverage overall, and to amplify the voice and selection of treatment options. The focus of HEPV in 2020 has very specifically been on evidence development for coverage decision-making. And within that context, we've been focusing on three specific initiatives. One is the application of real-world evidence and coverage and payer decision-making in HTA reviews. The other has been looking at patient preference research, what it is and how it can be incorporated and how it might best be incorporated into payer decision-making. And likewise, the group has been focused on an evidence playbook for manufacturers related to developing the evidence that's needed for positive coverage decisions from payers. So with respect to the forum today, there are a couple of very specific questions that I think are very important for us to get into. And certainly from Medtronic's perspective, as we think about real-world evidence, what can we do, in fact, to advance the use of real-world evidence in coverage decision-making? We've seen some very positive examples, and I'm going to get into one of them. But as we think about this going forward, some of the key topics that we want to cover today involve the following questions. And in particular, what do payers need to see to accept real-world evidence into their coverage decisions, their medical policy decision-making for medical technologies? And ultimately, we view this from two perspectives, which is as payers might be looking at technologies and determining their coverage approaches going forward, what do they look for in evidence on a pre-coverage basis so that it can be an important element of what they're taking into consideration when they're going to make a decision from a coverage or medical policy standpoint regarding the coverage of specific technology. Second one is, if in fact the payer happens to review a technology and determines that the evidence might be promising but not sufficient to grant coverage, what can then be done in a post-coverage space in order to drive the development of evidence that will lead to further information on the benefits of the technology and be able to inform the payer decision-making further. And again, we see applications there. So from our standpoint, we look at it and say, well, ultimately, what do payers need to see to accept real-world evidence into either one of those circumstances, whether or not it's before coverage or post-coverage? And likewise, then the question is, how can payers become more involved in the process to develop real-world evidence when it's needed for the purposes of understanding the benefits of medical technology and granting patient access to the technology? And obviously, from our perspective, Medicare has been quite out in front on these topics, and we view that as very positively. But the question is, how can these approaches conceivably be expanded and commercial payers, private payers, be brought more into the process when they're reviewing the technologies? Are there ways that we can look at real-world evidence and real-world evidence development that can be done in collaboration with payers? So I think those are some of the specific topics that, as we look at it from Medtronic's perspective, we're hoping to advance and gain some good discussion on today, as well as going forward in the general discussion of real-world evidence and where it fits into the payer process. And again, I want to highlight a very specific example that we think shows the significant benefits of new approaches to real-world evidence and how they can be incorporated into payer coverage thought. And this example is CMS's national coverage determination for important new technology, leadless pacemakers. In early 2017, Medicare issued a national coverage determination that granted coverage for leadless pacemakers, but it did so under its regimen of coverage with evidence development, where CMS thought that the evidence was promising for the technology, but wanted some further evidence to assure the agency of the benefits of the technology and its application in the Medicare population overall. Again, this was a technology that was approved by the FDA in early 2016. It was subject to national coverage decision-making through 2016, culminating with the NCD in 2017. And in this slide, you can see a picture of the leadless pacemaker in the upper right-hand corner. And again, this is an important new advancement in technology where the leadless pacemaker is roughly 1/9 the size of a traditional transvenous pacemaker. It's implanted directly into the chambers of the heart. And for this version of the device, it's into the right ventricle without need for a pulse generator in the chest or the leads that would otherwise be implanted into the chambers of the heart. So it combines all of that into a single device that goes directly into the chambers of the heart. And in reviewing this technology, CMS saw the need for coverage with evidence development and the development of additional data and evidence to support the benefits of the technology, and did so in a very novel and progressive way from our standpoint, which is that they in fact allowed the use of a prospective longitudinal analysis to demonstrate the benefits of the technology. And in their definition of prospective longitudinal analysis, it included the use of analysis that was based on measuring patient outcomes through the use of Medicare claims. And so what this, in fact, allowed for was population of individuals who received the technology to participate and an approach to collecting that evidence that was based on assessing outcomes based on the experience that was observed in Medicare claims data. And that experience would be, in fact, measured over a period of years prospectively in the collection of the Medicare claims data and the identification of patients who, in fact, received the device, and looking at the combination of diagnoses and procedures across the full set of Medicare claims to understand the experience with this population. The early results from the Micro Ced study were, in fact, presented just in May of 2020 this year at the scientific sessions of the Heart Rhythm Society. In fact, these were quite positive. But from our standpoint, this is a great example where CMS wanted additional evidence, created an approach whereby that evidence could be collected in a reasonably non-intrusive way through Medicare claims, and yet would yield a rich amount of data with respect to patient experience with the device. And from our standpoint, this is just an outstanding example of how real-world evidence informed Medicare claims can, in fact, be used to support coverage of technology. And these are the types of approaches that we would like to see more of going forward. And again, that leads to our interest in how, in what specific types of evidence payers would be willing to consider. How can payers be brought into this more? What are specific requirements on a pre-coverage or post-coverage? And again, what the payers want to see out of this evidence. And as you can see in this example, it's a very rigorous design with protocol listed on clinicaltrials.gov, brings a lot of methodological rigor to the approach to CED overall. So with that introduction and the potential for the use of real-world evidence in the device space from payers' perspective, I want to turn it over now to our next speaker, and that is Greg Daniel, who provides some further perspectives from the manufacturer viewpoint on real-world evidence.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm Greg Daniel with Edwards Life Sciences. I'm delighted to be reacquainted with everyone on this panel with whom I've worked many times before, while back at Brookings and the Duke Margolis Center. And I'd like to build off of what Jeff outlined and add my perspective on the value of real-world evidence, especially real-world evidence that's produced after product approval and when products are being used in the real-world practice setting, and to add some food for thought for the panel discussion. So first, in terms of the value of real-world evidence, I don't think anyone can argue that that real-world evidence does play a very important role in medical product development, access, and use. Real-world evidence done well can support continued innovation through fulfilling subsequent regulatory requirements, can certainly support coverage and patient access, which is the main focus of today's panel. But it can also support the clinical decisions and help measure and ensure products are being used appropriately and resulting in high quality care. So quality measurement is a big opportunity for real-world evidence, and then also supporting value-based payment models as we shift to value-based healthcare. And part of that, most importantly, measuring outcomes that really do matter to patients. So continuing to collect data and generating high-quality real-world evidence is the right thing to do for patients and the healthcare system, as long as it doesn't inappropriately restrict patient access. For implantable devices specifically, much of the real-world data elements needed to develop high-quality real-world evidence may not be available in claims data. I think Jeff gave a really good example of a study that can be used to where claims data did bring valuable information to the study. But oftentimes, outcomes that really do matter to patients, like quality of life, functional status, other sort of in-depth clinical elements that aren't available in claims data, could be cost prohibitive or hard to collect from electronic health records. And so prospective registries has been a primary source of real-world evidence for many medical device studies. And while they're great for making sure that you can get the high priority data elements that you actually need for that study, in some cases, like Jeff pointed out, you can use claims data, but oftentimes to get those high priority data elements, they may not be available in claims. But they're not perfect registries. They can be pretty burdensome to hospitals and clinical staff, particularly when registries require just a ton of data collection. So I think we need to look at sort of innovation in registries, registries that can be designed in a way that minimize the burden on providers by identifying just the minimal high priority data set that you need from registries, and then also leveraging the ability to link in claims data and electronic health records for some of the other data elements that are more routinely collected. And FDA and MDIC through NEST has been doing a lot to make sort of registry development much more efficient. So the FDA has led a lot in the area of real-world evidence. Recently, the Drug Center at FDA put forward a real-world evidence framework as part of the 21st Century Cures Act, which outlined major steps and consensus that's needed about real-world evidence and how that needs to be developed in order for real-world evidence to be used more routinely in regulatory decisions. And many organizations like my former Duke Margolis Center, but also the National Academies, ISPOR, and other groups, National Health Council, have put forth recommendations and frameworks for how to improve the data quality and fitness for use of real-world data. Data standardization, transparency, and methodologic rigor to support high-quality real-world evidence development that can be useful for FDA and regulatory decisions, but mostly on the drug side. CDRH and MDIC have also put forth guidance and recommendations as well, more specific to medical devices. But I think that the questions that are remaining about these data, real-world data, and the development of real-world evidence on medical devices and how payers view them are still left. There's much more to be discussed and to be developed on that side. So I think that the two questions that we pose for the panel are really important, and I'll just highlight them again. For real-world evidence collected after product approval, and for it to bring real value to payers and patients, what do payers need to see in order to accept real-world evidence into their coverage and medical policy decisions? So what can help improve their use of real-world evidence? But then also, what role can payers play to incentivize and make sure that the right data are being collected and the real-world evidence is being developed in a way that really does support their decisions? And again, claims data are great, but there are some clear limitations in terms of some studies that do require more specific data elements to be measured, opportunities to build a streamlined registry where you can link in claims and electronic health records. I think there's a lot to discuss there. So with that, I'll turn it back to Jeff and the rest of the panel. Thank you.
First, I want to address the notion that somehow health plans are wary of real-world evidence. It's just not the case. Real-world evidence has been in existence and available for decades. What is new now is, one, there are so many more opportunities with electronic health records, and there is a new focus with the 20th Century Cures Act on real-world evidence. But just to illustrate, in the mid-1980s, organ transplants, heart transplants, lung transplants, novel organ transplants beyond the traditional kidney and cornea became available. They were a tremendous, I'm just going to say it, shock to the healthcare system. This was a whole new level of cost and complexity. It was really groundbreaking. But all that is known about organ transplants, or virtually all that is known about organ transplants, their effectiveness, their success, their durability, their impact on the patient, comes from real-world evidence. It comes from registries, the UNOS registry in particular. But the first efforts were in the mid-1980s when the Health and Human Services Department collected every instance of an organ transplant in the U.S. and analyzed that. And by 86, all health plans were covering organ transplants based on this evidence. So I just want to make clear that there is no dichotomy in our minds that somehow real-world evidence is different or inferior or novel or something new that we have to think about. It is part of the multiple components of an evidence base around the technology, around an intervention, or around a test. So we need to focus on the variety and the diversity that exists in real-world evidence. I'll just go back momentarily to what the FDA has said, and we also see in other sources. For example, the NEST data quality framework and the NEST methodology framework. That first, we have data. The real world provides us with data that is produced in the course of clinical practice. That's what distinguishes what we call real world evidence from classic trial evidence. You are probably familiar with these issues. There is the curation of the data. There is the interoperability of the data. There is the data fit for purpose? Because remember, these data have been collected for a variety of reasons that are not particularly oriented to a research question. They're collected in the course of care. So a first level matter is that data usable? Is it fit for purpose? The data alone doesn't make evidence. Evidence is defining a research question and defining an appropriate methodology to answer that question. And I would like to remind us that real-world evidence and methods are quite diverse in what is available to us. It is not confined just to claims data or just to electronic health records. It also includes pragmatic trials. It includes, very importantly, registries. And I certainly agree with Jeff's point about the need to simplify data elements and data collection. I think that's true for classic trials as well. That is another discussion, but it is quite a pertinent one. So I want to remind us of the variety of methodologies that are available. The main point being that what is the question? What is the method proposed? How is that methodology executed? And in that respect, again, I'm going to refer to the NEST framework on methods. It really is telling us that for any real-world evidence study, very parallel to a clinical trial, a protocol is needed. What is the PICO? What are the patients? What are the interventions? What are the comparators? What are the outcomes? Very importantly, how are they going to be defined in terms of the data elements available? When we look at evidence in the blues, we look at the relevance of that evidence, and that is contained in the PICO. Do the studies really address the patient population of interest? Is the intervention clearly defined? Is the comparator an apt and appropriate comparator? And are those outcomes that are important? And by that we mean important to patients, and I think equally important to clinicians and other decision makers. We have long defined health outcomes in a very broad umbrella term: length of life, quality of life, ability to function. But what is critical in any given study is, what are your measures of those outcomes? Are we using a definable measure? Are we using a valid measure? So I say that only to point out that real-world evidence raises similar evidentiary questions, that is, about the methodology of the study and its appropriateness to answer a particular question. We are also interested not only in relevance of the evidence, relevance going back to the data, but also what are the methods? Are the statistical analysis appropriate? Are the comparisons appropriate? Is there missing data? Is there long enough follow-up? All of these are principles that apply wherever we look at evidence. So I would emphasize that real-world evidence is simply another element in our capability for evidence, and one that comes in quite a different and rich source of methodologies. Now, to turn to the matter that has come up here, what might payers do to foster evidence development? I'm going to answer that in two parts. Our own interest in the Blues is in communicating, engaging with sponsors early in their evidence development planning so that they understand what the expectations are and so how evidence will be looked at. We're really quite committed to that. We have been part of the Payer Communication Task Force. We have worked with AdvaMed in their value-based assessment training programs to get across these issues of what are the elements that we look for in evidence, what are the methodologies. With respect to a notion of coverage with evidence development, it is really not as applicable to our circumstances. The contractual basis is different in the private sector. Medicare has a concept of reasonable and necessary, which is the underlying principle to support coverage with evidence development. But in the private sector, contractual, for the most part, contractual matters are much more black and white. That is, there's a medically necessary provision, there's an investigational provision, and as plans look at it, they see a separation. They do not see an overlap. While we do have frameworks that can be used for a coverage with evidence development approach, they're really not widely accepted or adopted among our plans. I think there are probably two main issues. One is there is a conservatism. That is, when coverage is decided, there is a call for a certain confidence that we know what is being covered. There is a great reluctance to become involved in something that will be perceived as a take back. That is enormously complicated and negative from a plan point of view. So there is an inherent conservatism in how private plans approach coverage. And the other is, I think there is a philosophical position. Our position is different than, say, Medicare as a public program, and there is a sense that we are purchasers of care. We will end up covering and therefore paying for devices or drugs, and the development is really the accountability of the sponsor and is not appropriately an additional cost to the health plan, which is ultimately a cost to the members of the health plan. So with that, I think I have made my points, and I will turn this back to the group.
Hi, I'm Eleanor Perfetto, and I'm the Executive Vice President for Strategic Initiatives with the National Health Council. I want to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to be here today. And I want to give you just a little tiny bit of background about the National Health Council so that you understand my perspective in this conversation. The Council is a membership organization, so we don't have any individual members. We have only organizational members. And the largest group, the largest category of membership is patient advocacy organizations. And so we learn from and listen to what the patient advocacy organizations tell us about the views of the patient community on a variety of topics. And one of them that we've talked to them about, especially since 21st Century Cures, has been this idea of real-world evidence and trying to learn what is the view of the patient community on real-world evidence and its use. So we've done some qualitative research, and it was quite interesting. We did some interviews with patients and patient groups and have talked to them about this, and we learned a few things. One of them is that, in general, the reaction to real-world evidence and what it is was actually quite positive. Most of the patients that we interviewed said that they were very much in favor of real-world evidence being used in decision-making when it came to the quality of care or the adverse events from treatments, or generating hypotheses about new uses or what's going on with treatment and care. They were very much in favor of seeing real-world evidence be used for those kinds of things. They were also moderately supportive of real-world evidence being used for new approvals for medications. So if something was already approved by the FDA for one use, they were in favor of it being real-world evidence being used for consideration of new uses. However, they were very much against drugs being approved for the first time on the basis of real-world evidence alone. I don't think any of those findings are quite remarkable. I think that's what we would have expected, and that the expectation of the patient community is that real-world evidence is being used, and that they would look to good quality evidence to be used in decision-making and are very much behind that. Another thing that we learned is about the patient group's comfort level with real-world evidence. They wanted to learn more. They want to know more, and they want to be very much engaged in the process of real-world evidence discussions and development. So the output of that was, of course, that we needed to do some capacity building for the patient community, and we've developed some training programs and educational programs so that our patient group membership will be able to learn more about real-world evidence and how it's being used and what good looks like, but also about how they could contribute to the process. Because another thing that we learned from them is that they're very, very interested in being involved in the development of real-world evidence, not just having real-world evidence used to affect their access to care. So what do I mean by being involved in the development? You might think, well, real-world evidence is using claims databases, it's using registries, it's using those kinds of things. So what impact could patient engagement possibly have in the development of those kinds of studies? Well, first of all, patients' reactions were, hey, wait a minute, claims data isn't real-world evidence. Claims data doesn't tell you anything about me. You get real-world evidence about me by asking me questions. And so they really saw things like claims and registries as being very narrow unless they were actually doing things to reach out to patients to get patient-level information from them, patient-reported information. The other was that we had some discussions with patients and with researchers about how the information that patients provide or could help make real-world studies more rigorous. So let me give you an example of what that might look like. In the area of atrial fibrillation, there is a lot of real-world evidence research, of course, that gets done, but we learned that much of that research gets started by looking at things like claims data or registries where patients have been diagnosed. And what many of those things don't capture are the number of years that patients had a wrong diagnosis or a misdiagnosis, where their atrial fibrillation had been diagnosed as anxiety attacks, panic attacks, GI disturbances. And so if a real-world researcher looked in a database and started to follow a patient from the date that they got an accurate diagnosis of atrial fibrillation, they would have been starting that research years after the problem had already been identified by that patient, and they would have missed all of those misdiagnoses that happened prior to that. Another example within atrial fibrillation has to do with triggers. Patients very often talk about triggers to their atrial fibrillation episode. There's been hardly any research on this aspect of triggers. Hearing from patients and understanding about what triggers meant to them and what they described as triggers led to surveys of patients with atrial fibrillation to actually gather what their triggers are. As it turned out, triggers are things like caffeine, alcohol, things like that, things that you wouldn't find in the claims database and things that you would have to be sure that you were asking in a registry, but also things you would want to be sure to collect from patients if you were about to collect real-world data through patient-reported outcomes to be able to be sure that you're capturing what those triggers look like. So conversations with patients even before the research starts, in that planning phase when you're getting to the idea of a research question, can be very valuable and can really make a contribution to adding to the rigor of real-world studies. When we talk about value-based agreements, value-based purchasing, and things like collecting coverage with evidence development, I think it falls into the same category. It's really important to be sure, number one, that you're having the conversations with some patients or some subset of patients that would be the target population for that study, to be sure that they can contribute what they know and their experiences, to be sure that the study is really on target and that the research question is really on target. And in value-based agreements, it would be very important to understand what patients find important, because a sponsor and a payer, or whomever the organization is that the agreement is being set up with, could be setting up an agreement that would be doomed to failure because they've chosen outcome endpoints to follow that are the outcome endpoints that patients don't really care very much about. And so it's really important to have those conversations. The second aspect of that is in terms of transparency. Patients do have a right to understand what kind of outcomes are being studied and how they're being monitored and how they're being followed over time, because there is some type of value-based arrangement involved, and they would want to be able to know and be engaged in that. Lastly, I would say that one of the very important things that could help link all of this together, this idea of what we're doing in terms of patient-focused drug development and having patients engaged in the clinical trial process and in the whole life cycle of the development of the product, a medical product. We would want to see patients be engaged in all of that, but the information that comes out of activities like that is cross-cutting. It can filter into so many other things. And so the idea of really thinking about developing patient-centered core outcome sets that help us understand what's important to patients, and then using that patient-centered core outcome set to then enrich patient-focused drug development, enrich value-based purchasing agreements, quality and quality assurance programs, and all of those kinds of things are really an important place for us to think about beginning, and that could be the thread that links all of these things together in a cohesive way, ensuring that we have patients involved, that they're engaged, they're not only there as study subjects or as the recipient of care, but they're actually there in the development of the programs from the very beginning. And we have seen in many ways where they can contribute to real-world data and real-world evidence. Thank you.
So like my previous panel members, I wanted to thank you for inviting me to be on this panel today. We have many great experts from the device manufacturers, private payers, and a patient advocate. And I think one of the things that we can draw from each of my previous panels is that every one of the groups that they represent bring a perspective that's important in developing real-world evidence that will benefit all of us. And most importantly, the patients, as Eleanor has pointed out, and our clinicians who are treating the patients. And so as I was sitting here listening today, I certainly, every time I listen to each one of them, I always learn something new that I try to bring back to CMS and Medicare, and try to think about those types of things as we create different policies in the Medicare program. One of the, as Jeff started off the panel, one of the national coverage determinations that we first started off with real-world evidence, where we really called it out, was with leadless pacemakers, and where we had some questions that we thought that claims data could answer, and it was a way for us to try a new way of collecting data to answer questions that would have low burden, or at least lower burden than perhaps a RCT, a randomized controlled trial, or even a registry. So, and I think this experiment has gone very, very well. And then most recently, we just issued a few weeks ago our tier national coverage determination, where we did not issue anything with coverage with evidence development. It's a proposed decision. And we did call out real world evidence there as well. And we do think it's going to be an important aspect to continue to look at this technology, hoping without CMS's pushing that the industry, the patient advocates, and others will continue to develop real-world evidence so that all of us can watch it to determine if we need to change one way or another when we cover particular technologies for either the Medicare population or for the private payer population. So I think as I listened to the previous speakers, there's nothing that I disagree with everything they say. I think we are all in the same place, that we think it is beneficial. I think we all think that we all have a role to play to ensure that it's robust, to make sure that the data that we get is something that we can rely on, so that patients can rely on it to make decisions with their clinician and what is the best treatment for them, that manufacturers can rely on the data to determine what they're going to do next, so that patients have broad access. And then for payers to know that we're actually buying the right types of treatments, diagnostics, screening tools for the beneficiaries, in my case, that we are covering. And I think as a payer, I think Naomi really outlines it quite well on what we look at. What is the question that we have? And then is it a robust methodology that can answer that particular question? And I think there's a lot of different data sources that can answer that question. And so, so I think real world evidence has been around for a long time, but I think we are getting better and better at trying to figure out how we answer those questions with real world evidence. CMS, I think, has a unique position where we can try different things, where we can try coverage with evidence development and use real world evidence with coverage with evidence development. The other thing that is unique with CMS is trying to get the outside, or I guess the public, to comment on our policies. So anything that we issue in the coverage world, we open it up and let everyone know, here's what we're taking a look at. Here's the scope of what we're looking at. Please give us some comments on that to make sure that we have the right scope. And then I think more importantly, we issue a proposed decision to make sure that we have the right coverage, the right access, and are we asking the right questions? So to Eleanor's point, are these questions important to patients? And so this is an opportunity for patients to say, well, we need really something else, or you need to add, or this really isn't important. But this is also an opportunity for device manufacturers or others to comment to make sure that we have the right coverage perspective and the right questions. And this is also an opportunity for any other stakeholder to have those comments before we issue the final policy. And it's a way for us to try to get it right. And so I think really the bottom line for us, and as we listen to the previous speakers, is we all need to listen to each other. We all have very important points on how to move this forward. And I think that all of us working together collaboratively make real world evidence or any other type of evidence very beneficial for each one of us, and helps us get to the right decisions, whether that is most importantly for the patient, the clinician who's working with that patient, or the payer to ensure that we're giving the appropriate access to our patients and giving the right tools to the clinicians that are treating our patients, and also the information to the manufacturers so that it is, I guess, predictive, so that they're not always guessing on what it is we are looking for. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.
All right, that was a great set of presentations. Let me thank everyone for the very informative, useful, candid remarks overall. And again, I agree with a lot of the sentiment here that I think there's a lot of great positions represented here. I think there's a lot of great willingness to understand how we can use real-world evidence, what are the best circumstances, what are the various stakeholders here looking for when they're looking at it. So I thought that was incredibly helpful. I will start with some questions, and again, I'd encourage all of us to engage in just open dialogue and discussion here on some of the topics that we've covered thus far. So I want to start. With you, Naomi, and again, I appreciated your remarks, and you covered several topics. First that I come to is essentially use the example of organ transplants, and that's great. And I'm wondering, in your recent reviews at BCBSA, any specific technologies or examples stand out to you as ones that have been done particularly well for the most part, or if anything else stands out to you in terms of what is a good practice here? And maybe, again, if you can, if it's even more informative, what was done badly when someone submitted a company or a sponsor might have submitted some information to you that you really just didn't think was credible? I mean, I could look at it from either side, but talk about some of the recent experiences that you've had with respect to evidence on technologies that BCBSA has looked at.
Well, I think we're constantly communicating that. We see that, I think these are hallmark issues with evidence, not real world evidence in particular, but evidence in general. I referred to the PICO. I referred to our relevance criteria. Who are these patients? Who are they? What exactly is the intervention? Sometimes it's kind of vague. Sometimes we see literature that's on an older version and it's not the one in current use. The comparator. Is it a fair and applicable comparator? Is it really the best alternative in standard care or the reasonable alternative in standard care? Is it given at the same intensity? Or is it somehow delivered in a way that sets up a strong end? That's an issue. And then I'm going to come to what I think is the largest issue of all, which is outcome measures. That is, we all talk about outcomes, health outcomes, etc. It means nothing unless you know how to measure them. And you need a set of, I can see that Ellen is nodding her head. Thank you, Ellen. We need a set, really a core set of validated outcome measures for different conditions that are go-to measures, that we know what this means, we know how it's defined, we know what the validity is, and most of all, we know what a clinically meaningful difference is. And we need that desperately. So with that, I think I have shared with you some highlights. I'm sure others have something to say.
So Naomi, just one other question, and then we'll move on. The notion of how plans can participate in evidence development activities post-coverage. Again, you noted some of the contractual requirements and distinguish between coverage and investigational. And again, you look at it from the perspective of the association. To what extent do you think individual plans have flexibility? As again, I think as manufacturers think about the different ways that we interact, I think a lot of when we're coming for coverage, obviously BCBSA conducts broad tech assessments, evidence reviews, but obviously when we go to seek coverage directly from the plans, do you think that there's flexibility there or opportunity for companies to approach individual plans on this notion of extended coverage with evidence development?
I think it is very narrow. Yes, there are plans that are open to that, but typically the situation is one in which it is the development, the innovation is taking place at a local institution, right, very embedded in local relationships. That plan may even be that institution may even be a member plan of the health plan. So it is very specific. It is not broadly available. Yes, there are instances of this, but there are not many.
Right. It's helpful.
Yeah, Jeff, this is Greg. I just want to add to Naomi's earlier point on the sort of the need for a catalog of outcomes that are valid and reliable, and link that to Eleanor's comment on sort of these obviously the outcomes that are most meaningful to patients. I think Eleanor, you called for. We need a better understanding on what those outcomes are. That's the first thing. But the second thing is to make sure that payers and other sort of decision makers across the healthcare system use those outcomes and value evidence on those outcomes. And I just point out, the group ICHOM has been developing sort of standard sets across different disease areas that focus on, what are important outcomes from the patient's perspective. And so a lot has gone into that, Michael Porter's group, ICHOM. So that I think that's a good step to develop those. But I think that the next step is, again, to Eleanor and to Naomi's point, it's one thing to know what those outcomes are. It's another thing to make sure that evidence is developed on those outcomes, and that that evidence is developed in a way that's useful to patients and to payers and other healthcare stakeholders.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think we need them as a common thread. So if we could think about core outcome sets as that common thread that could help us, because we would be targeting maybe not the exact specific measure, but comparable or measures that could map to one another across different uses. So if we all agree what the core concepts are for those outcomes, then we can all figure out how would they be measured in particular circumstances, because sometimes methodologically some variation may have to take place, but at least we're all going after the same targets and we all understand the same language. And so we would have that common set of concepts. From there, the core measures could be developed, the core endpoints that come out of that could be targeted. We'd all be talking the same language, so that all the way through, the thread gets pulled all the way through. Clinical trials would be based upon those core outcomes. The real world evidence studies could be based upon those core outcomes, and all those uses that we have that are all those downstream uses for decision making would all have a common platform, and we'd be able to map to one another. And it could really help us in kind of putting our resources in the right place. But as Greg said, my emphasis is always that we ask patients what's important to them in order for us to figure out what the concepts are that we should be focusing on most primarily and most urgently.
So, Eleanor, along those lines, again, the example that you used, and I thought it was a good one, was atrial fibrillation. And again, the way that patient input can be very important in terms of identifying the condition early on. How do you see that, for example, along the lines of outcomes measures, and development of appropriate sets along the lines of what ICHM is doing? What's happened in atrial fibrillation, and what are the ways that patient groups are involved in that, or measures that have been developed on that side of it?
So to Greg's point, there are a few groups out there like ICHM, COMET, CMTP, groups that have been working on the core outcome set and thinking about it in a couple of ways. What other methods that are needed that will be rigorous enough that everyone will buy in and say, yes, this is the core outcome set. So I think we do need to have some work, and I know ISAQUAL is doing a conference on that this coming year, on the methodology and thinking that through. So that's one of the things that we all need to rally behind. There isn't a sure, proven way that everybody should be doing this. But certainly one of the ways is that you begin this process by talking to patients. You think about who, as Naomi said earlier, who are the patients that we should be talking to? What's the target population here? Let's figure out who they are. Let's talk to them and find out what's important to them. Of course, plenty of qualitative methodology that can be used for this, very similar to what the FDA is talking about in terms of patient-focused drug development. Begin the conversation with the patient and understand what's important to them before you set down a road of identifying what the endpoints are for clinical trials. So voice of the patient meetings, like what the FDA has held, qualitative research, gather that information. Let's find out what concepts are really important. And then, as to Naomi's point, let's figure out how we clearly, accurately, validly, and reliably measure those concepts and turn them into a measure that can then subsequently be used as an endpoint for the kind of work that we need to do in so many areas where the work gets done. So there are frameworks for thinking about this. We all need, in many sectors, to roll up our sleeves and figure out what's the best way for us to do this, to get those targeted sets. There are some sets that exist out there in many different diseases. We can start by looking at some of those, but we have to also ensure that patients have been engaged adequately enough that they are patient-centered outcome sets.
Jeff,
No,
may I make a point here?
Absolutely.
I think there's a thrust to many of the things we're saying, which is not only are we trying to improve the focus and the yield and the quality of evidence we get, but that we're actually trying to make evidence collection more efficient. If you have defined outcomes, if you have defined rules of how you conduct trials, I can tell you that what we see is tremendous waste in the healthcare research system. Waste of patients who are going into trials that yield no information, that are underpowered, that do not collect the right outcomes. and yet there is a complaint about the burden of research and the burden of evidence. We can reduce that burden if we have clear rules that are followed. We waste a tremendous amount in this system.
And I would add that the irony is very often when we talk to different sectors about engaging patients and bringing them into the process early and understanding what's important to them, the irony is we get this pushback that says, oh no, it's too expensive to do that. It's going to be too burdensome to do that. We're going to slow everything down if we do that. Well, it's better to do it a little bit more slowly and get it right than to have the inefficiency that Naomi's talking about.
That's great. Guys, we only have a couple of moments left, and I do want to address one question to Tamara as well. And again, Tamara, I appreciate your remarks as always. It's great to get the perspective from CMS and from your personal perspective as well. But give us a sense of where CMS wants to be in the future on these topics. And obviously, there are some rules that are forthcoming. I know there are limitations on what you can say, but what do you see as an ideal balance going forward with respect to real world evidence and reviews of technologies and gaining evidence, but granting patient access as well?
Wow, you always leave the easy questions for me. I appreciate that. So that's a hard question to answer. I know that CMS, as you had just mentioned, a lot of our payment rules are coming out shortly or due to come out shortly. And I know that we have a lot of ideas that hopefully will be published publicly in the short term. But I think, I always go back to the same concept, and I think everyone says it slightly differently. It's really about collaboration and trying to collectively decide what is the best way to collect the evidence that we need to satisfy all of the folks that are represented here. The patients, I think the only one we don't have represented is the clinicians. The patients, the clinicians, the payers, and the manufacturers. So I don't know that I have a clear answer to your question because I don't know what is the ideal, but I think it's a balance between low burden, trying to answer the question that's important to the patients and the clinicians and the payers, and in a way that we can also grant appropriate access to all of our patients. And I think that CMS has tried a lot of different ways to get there. So I think at one point, we have some decisions that have RCTs, and I know that's a very tough place for everyone to be. We have some NCDs that do coverage with evidence development with registries and, trying to get information there. And then we have some national coverage determinations that are using claims data. So there's a lot of different types of ways that we're trying to get there, and there may be more. And so we need to figure out which ones are the right ones, and it may be different for different technologies or for different questions. And I think the bottom line for us is to be collaborative, but also flexible to try to get to where we need to be in the most straight line as we can get there, and to ensure that our beneficiaries get the appropriate access and we give the tools to our clinicians that they need to treat our patients. And I think this has really, really come to the forefront in what has been happening since March with COVID and the pandemic, and how, real world evidence is happening right in front of our eyes in a lot of different ways, and how we're treating patients and how quickly we're moving, and we're learning what we're doing wrong and we're learning what we're doing right, but it's happening really fast. And so hopefully we can look back and have some lessons learned on how we're going to move forward as a country in healthcare in general. So a long way, probably not to specifically answer your question, because I'm not sure I know an answer yet.
Jeff, can I add to that? I thought,
absolutely.
For not being able to directly answer the question, I thought Tamara did a fantastic job. I totally agree. And I think she's right. Start with, if you're thinking about the vision for the future, start with the patient and making sure that we have high quality real world evidence that reflects patients' views done right. And if we can, and I think on this panel, we all agree with that. The question is then, how can we make sure that gets done most efficiently with least burden to providers and hospital systems that are doing these registries, and that engage the patients and make sure that they're there. So if we agree with where we need to go, the big question is, how do we just get the stakeholders aligned, all of the stakeholders aligned with making sure that that evidence and data are collected?
And sometimes it just requires some, I mean, it's the toughest thing to do, but it requires cultural change because people have to think a little differently. They're not doing their research the way that they used to. They're going to have to make some changes, and that can be hard.
And I'm going to add that sometimes you don't get everybody aligned, but if you have a group moving forward and you have a group leading, then other things will follow.
Agreed.
Right. And the last thing that I would add is, I've, like many of you, I've been doing this for longer than I care to admit, but well over 15, 20 years now. And we can see how we have progressed over the last decade. But I think that the leaders in this area need to also be very comfortable that perhaps we can try something and we fail, because we learn a lot when we fail, and then we can pivot and hopefully make more strides faster. But I think we can't be worried about failing every time, that we have to get it right every single time, that we need to try different things.
That's great. And I think that's a great point to conclude on here. So on behalf of myself, on behalf of MDIC, let me thank all of you for your participation in today's panel. Presentations were great, and I think shed light on a lot of the issues that arise with respect to the use of real-world evidence in the payer environment. It's been very helpful, and I'm sure that our listeners and certainly the companies who are engaged, and certainly I know that I've learned a lot. We can take this as we think about what we do in our broad evidence development strategies and how real-world evidence fits in. So on that note, thank you very much. Have a great day. Tune into the remaining MDIC forums.
Thank you for attending MDIC's annual public forum. We hope you will join us for next week's session for an update on NEST CC 2020, progress priorities, and the path ahead. Visit apf.mdic.org for more information and to catch up on previous sessions.